economy has hit some choppy waters with the announcement of stiff tariffs, threats of a trade war, and stomach-churning drops in the stock market. Joining me now to discuss it all, Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Fox News Sunday.
Thank you. Great to be here with you.
U.S. stocks just had their worst week in 2 years. The Dow fell more than 1,400 points. That's a 5.7% drop. What's going on, and how long will it last?
Well, Chris, there's a lot of different things impacting the stock market, but I think the most important thing to focus on is the market will go up and down in the short term. The real important issue is where will it be longer term, and the market is still up an enormous amount since the election, and we're confident as we continue on our economic plans that will translate into the market doing better.
To talk about why it is dropping right now, 1,100 points of that drop came Thursday and Friday after President Trump announced that he's going to impose tariffs on $60 billion of Chinese exports. Are the markets wrong to react so negatively to the president's tariffs?
Well, Chris, I've never thought that the markets are necessarily efficient. There's a lot of things that went on last week, including the Fed. But as it relates to the tariffs, there's really been three parts of our economic plan, and we've been very consistent from day one. Tax reform, regulatory relief, and trade. And now we are executing on the third part of our plan. So I don't think anybody should be surprised. This is a president that absolutely believes in free trade, but wants free and fair trade, and has been very clear since our first meeting in Mar-a-Lago with President Xi that the trade deficit has to be addressed, that they need to open up their markets to our companies, and that's fair and free reciprocal trade.
But to press my point, are the markets wrong to be afraid of the president's tariffs and the impact it'll have on the economy?
I don't expect to see a big impact on the economy. We've been very careful in how we're doing this and what we're doing. But again, I think what we're doing is long-term very good for the economy, which it is pressing for free and fair trade. And to the extent that China is willing to open up their markets, which they're making all the right directions on, but if they open up their markets, it's an enormous opportunity for U.S. companies.
Of course, the fear is that that's not going to be the way they respond. The fear is that the response to the president's tariffs is going to be a trade war with China, and the day after the president announced his tariffs, China announced plans to impose its own tariffs on $3 billion in U.S. exports and the possibility of billions of dollars more in U.S. exports, whether it's American soybeans or Boeing jets. I know that you spoke with the Chinese vice premier yesterday, who, according to the Chinese news agency, said that China is prepared to defend its interests. Do you really believe Beijing is going to blink?
Well, it's not a question of blinking. I think we've been very clear in what we want, and they understand that. President Xi, Liu He have acknowledged that our shared objective is to reduce the trade deficit. So, as President Trump said, we're not afraid of a trade war, but that's not our objective. And I've had very productive conversations with the vice premier. He came to Washington. We've communicated several times since then. We continued to have a discussion the other night. And I think we're working on a pathway to see if we can reach an agreement as to what fair trade is for them to open up their markets, reduce their tariffs, stop forced technology transfer. These are all the things we want to do. But in a negotiation, you have to be prepared to take action, and that's what President Trump is doing.
So I just want to make sure I'm clear here, because the president announced $60 billion in tariffs. The Chinese talked about $3 billion and the possibility of more. And as I say, the vice premier talked about defending Beijing's interests. Are you suggesting that none of this is going to happen, that you're going to be able to avoid it, and that none of these tariffs will actually go into effect?
Well, we are going to proceed with our tariffs. We're working on that. We're also working on investment restrictions, but we're simultaneously having negotiations with the Chinese to see if we can reach an agreement. As the president has said, we want to cut the trade deficit $100 billion over the next year. We want to eliminate forced joint ventures, forced technology, and we're having very productive conversations with them. I'm cautiously hopeful we reach an agreement, but if not, we are proceeding with these tariffs. We are not putting them on hold unless we have an acceptable agreement that the president signs off on.
Earlier this month, the president announced different tariffs on aluminum and steel imports into this country. And one of his top advisors on trade, Peter Navarro, was in this program right after they were announced. And he said that this was going to be a global imposition of tariffs on every nation that sends metals to this country. Take a look.
You have to understand, Chris, as soon as he starts exempting countries, he has to raise the tariff on everybody else. As soon as he exempts one country, his phone starts ringing from the heads of state of other countries.
But that's not what happened. The administration has now exempted Canada and Mexico and the European Union and South Korea and almost all of the major exporters of aluminum and steel. I guess my question is, what was the point of announcing global tariffs in the first place when you took them all away?
Well, Chris, I think the strategy's worked, quite frankly. So we announced the tariffs. We said we were going to proceed. But again, we said we'd simultaneously negotiate. And I'm pleased to say Ambassador Lighthizer reached a very productive understanding with South Korea, not just on these tariffs, but on the KORUS trade agreement overall. We expect to sign that agreement soon. And there is a quota. So South Korea will reduce the amount of steel that they send into the United States as part of this. So I think this is an absolute win-win. When I was at the G20 last week, I had many discussions with my counterparts. So where we've put a pause on tariffs, we're negotiating.
President Trump said that his policies, and especially the big tax cut that was passed at the end of last year, would unleash strong economic growth. Here is the president.
To get it going the way I really want, where we have GDP getting up to 4, 5, and even 6%, because I think that's possible.
But the Federal Reserve just came out with its projection, and it's not 4 or 5 or 6% growth. It's 2.7% this year, declining to 2.4% in 2019. Again, this is the projection of the Federal Reserve. Question, what happened to the boom?
Well, I think we've absolutely had a boom, and that's why the Fed raised their projection to 2.7. It was substantially lower. Part of the reason why they're projecting to raise interest rates is because of the exceptional performance of the economy. And as I've repeatedly said, our objective is 3% or higher. The president would like us to get higher than that, but at 3%, there's trillions of dollars of additional revenue to the government and tens of trillions of economic growth. So,
but they're saying for the next 2 years, the Fed is, you're not going to reach 3%. It's going to be 2.7 and then 2.4.
Well, again, as you know, the Fed is independent of us, and I respect their projections. Our projections are higher, but I think what to focus on is their projections are up significantly, and we've now had we've had 2 quarters of 3% GDP. We are well on our way to the 3% growth. And tax reform and tax cuts are a big part of that. We're seeing enormous investment back in the United States and great success on that.
Do you think the Fed is raising interest rates too quickly?
Well, again, I respect Fed independence, so I'm not going to comment on that. But what I would say is the market expects interest rates are going to go up. That's built into the forward curve. So the only question is, how fast do they raise them and where does it stop? And I think that's something that they will balance as they see economic growth. I think the Fed is very committed to make sure that they don't cut off economic growth.
When the corporate tax bill was passed, you and the president promised that most of the benefits were going to go to workers, but that's not in fact what has happened so far. I want to put up this chart. According to one study, S&P companies have given employees $5.2 billion in bonuses and higher wages, the kinds of things you and the president talked about. But at the same time, they spent $157 billion on stock buybacks. So far, the tax cuts are going to shareholders. They're not going to workers.
Well, Chris, first of all, we're only a couple of months into this. So I think you have over 4.5 million Americans that have received special bonuses. That's an enormous situation. I was at Boeing last week with the president, or 2 weeks ago, viewing the factory. There were a lot of happy workers there. I was at Apple, who's committed to put $350 billion back into the United States. These are massive commitments. And as I've commented, there's nothing wrong with share buybacks. Share buybacks are just an allocation of capital. If a company can't effectively use that capital, it will return it to shareholders. In many cases, that's pensions and other large investors who then invest that capital back into companies that need the capital.
But are you disappointed that $5 billion is going to workers and $150 billion is going to shareholders?
It's not an equivalent comparison. So again, that $150 billion that's going back to shareholders gets recycled into the economy. The $5 billion that's going to workers is an enormous amount of money that we didn't even expect to see right away. What we've expected to see is over the course of the next year, wages increase something like $4,500, and that's a lot of money. So I think you're seeing absolutely the impact that we thought, and more so on the tax plan.
Finally, we had some drama on Friday when President Trump threatened for a few hours to veto the $1.3 trillion spending bill that Congress had passed, and then eventually signed it. And when he signed it, not very happily, he issued this warning.
I say to Congress, I will never sign another bill like this again. I'm not going to do it again.
Question, what is the president saying? Is he saying that he'll not sign another omnibus spending bill, that it's got to be individual spending bills for each department? And this is something, the Republicans are in control of the House and the Senate, and the bill that was passed. Aren't they responsible for this big omnibus grab bag spending bill?
Not at all. So first of all, as you know, you need bipartisan support in the Senate to get the bill passed. So even though the Republicans control the Senate, they couldn't pass this alone. It was a difficult decision for the president, and I understand that, because the president's main priority was to get money for the military. Given everything that's going on in the world, that is absolutely critical. And the Democrats held us up. Our original budget was we would keep everything else balanced, but the Democrats demanded a massive increase in non-military spending. And that's going to balloon the deficit, and that's something we're going to have to deal with.
But I was going to say, that's going to happen next time. When the next spending bill comes up in October, they're going to be demanding parity as well. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but it is reality.
Well, it doesn't need to be reality, and I'm not going to comment on what the president will do, but as you heard him say, he's not planning on doing this again. I think they should give the president a line item veto. These things should be looked at.
That's been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, sir.
Well, again, Congress could pass a rule, okay, that allows them to do it.
No, sir. It'd be a constitutional amendment.
Chris, we don't need to get into a debate in terms of there's different ways of doing this. My comment is it's clear what happened. The Democrats, in order to get us military spending, demanded a massive increase in non-military spending. And the president made the decision this time that was worth it, because military spending, given what's going on in Iran, in North Korea, in Venezuela, in Russia, all around the world where we're using sanctions, we need to make sure we have a military that has the necessary resources.
Secretary Mnuchin, thank you. Thanks for your time this weekend. I always appreciate your willingness to take all our questions and answer them. Thank you, sir. Always good to talk.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here.
Up next, more shakeups at the White House as President Trump names former Ambassador John